Hi, Stephanie. Welcome to the show. It is such a pleasure to have you on today.
Thanks, Vanessa. I'm so excited to be here with you.
Likewise, likewise. This is a topic that we haven't really covered yet on this show, and I think it's much needed, as you and I kind of have spoken about off air. And I think there's so many details, and we can go in a million different directions. But I think we've got a good course of action here, so I can't wait to get into all of the things. And before we get going, though, why don't you tell us a little bit about you? Why don't you tell us how you got into this work, how you landed in this field, what led you to become a nutritionist and kind of focus on hormone health and all of that?
Yeah. And this question is always like, well, where do you start? Do you start back with like, when I was a little kid, knew I couldn't wait to be a mom, or fast forward a couple decades? But yeah, so just a little bit about me. My name's Stefanie Adler. I'm a functional diagnostic practitioner, and I really feel so passionate about helping women be able to work with their bodies to accomplish whatever that means for that, for them to feel most fulfilled in life. And so for a lot of the women that I work with, hormone balance issues or gut health issues or a combination of all of these things which are so connected in the body will really hold them back from whether that's actualizing their dream of becoming a mom or you know feeling good in their body and in their careers, whatever it is. So how I got into this is, I think, how a lot of practitioners got into this is because I had my own issues, right? And the conventional path for addressing these issues wasn't working for me. And so as young as I literally can remember, my mom says even as a baby, like I had stomach issues. And I just remember having digestive issues my entire life. And I actually, went and saw a gastrointestinal doctor when I was probably starting around the age of like 10 or 11 through the ages of around 13. And I recently found out as an adult that my mom recently told me that the doctor said to my mom that she thought I was making it up for attention and that she had real kids to treat and like to get out of her office and stop wasting her time.
Whoa.
And it was because they ran every test they could on me and they couldn't figure out what it was. So they just labeled it IBS and gave me a bunch of medications that didn't feel good and didn't work. Right. And so I guess even at a young age, I just wasn't willing to accept that this is it, that I just have to deal with this for the rest of my life. And that really triggered this doctor because that was what you did. If you have IBS, then you just deal with it. So that was like a little bit of my background, just like having always dealt with these issues. And at the age of 13, I decided to change my diet despite this doctor's belief that that wouldn't change anything for me. And it did. Symptoms I'd been having for 13 years went away in 3 months. And I became very aware of the relationship between food as a catalyst for dis-ease in the body or for health and healing and wellness. So fast forward that, another 8 or so years, and I have known I always want to be a mom. I shared a lot of the same issues with my aunt on my mom's side. Like we had all the same stomach issues. We had all the same period issues. And we can start to talk about this. Like my doctor thought maybe I had endometriosis and put me on a birth control pill at the age of 12 because of it after having had two periods. And so I knew in the back of my mind, like, okay, I have all these same issues as my aunt. She needed to use in vitro and had to have a really hard time getting pregnant with my cousins. And I was really nervous about my hormonal health. I also was experiencing a lot of anxiety and still some gut issues, which I would have thought after changing my diet and like feeling a lot better, I would have been able to figure out. And so when I went back to school for nutrition, there's a whole nother little story there, but I have an undergrad in something else. And then I went and got a second degree in holistic nutrition. I realized that I needed to pay attention to this hormonal component. I needed to get off of hormonal birth control and just really rediscover and learn everything I could about the female hormone system because one, I wanted to prepare myself for being able to become a mother one day and also just feel connected to my feminine and my body. And so that was kind of how I got started in this. And when I went back to school in nutrition, I specialized in everything from preconception care through baby's first foods and have just loved getting to work now in this field and helping bring over 60 babies into the world. And help
Wow.
those mamas actualize that dream and also just help hundreds of women have healthy, normal cycles after medical professionals have told them it wouldn't be possible for them.
Wow. Wow. Well, first of all, you are so young to start this journey. I mean, usually, it's like, and I'm sure you know it too, yourself being having a podcast. It's like everyone that comes on has their own story, and it's like, I sound like a broken record because I'm always saying that. Like everybody's got their own story and, everybody's led to what their calling is or what they're supposed to be ministering in, so to speak, from their own experiences. But you were really, really young. So I'm sure that like you almost probably had to grow up a bit fast in that arena, because most 12, 13-year-olds are not thinking about, wow, how does food affect the body and how, my hormones and, like going on the pill at 12 or 13 years old. I mean, and I know it happens. I know it happens, but that is rough, especially when we're talking about what we know now, from a risk side. So it's just insane, but here you are.
Yeah, and it's crazy. I mean, I work with so many women in my practice who are in their 30s who've been on the pill since they were 15. And they're coming to me and they're like, okay, I've been on the pill for 16 years and like I want to have a baby or whatever it is. And it's just the biggest experiment that we've ever done. Like it's never been studied at any significant length of time, never less decades. And like, what does it mean to be suppressing ovulation for decades at a time during these years? Like we're just only starting to scratch the surface of what that means. Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah. And I relate to it a bit because I went on it, I believe at 19. I think I was 19 years old when I went on it, not having any, it's funny when I was preparing for this podcast, I took myself back there a bit. And I remember thinking, no one told me not even one, side effect or anything that would potentially be something to pay attention to or to consider going on that pill. And I also was someone who pretty early age had the same diagnosis as you with the IBS and the gut issues. And that came off the heels of a virus and everything started from there. But it was just the kind of similar, gastroenterologist, 2 colonoscopies. By the time I was 25 or 26 years old, it's like they put you through the gamut and they give you the name and they're like, okay, you can live with it now. I mean, you know how it is, right?
This diagnosis that means we don't know what's actually wrong with you. And
Exactly.
I
Exactly.
always say IBS is the most BS diagnosis there is.
I like that. I like that. I always say it's just such a bucket diagnosis, It's like just whatever. Throw all the symptoms in the bucket and here you go. It's sad and still today I think people take that diagnosis, not to get off course too much, but take that diagnosis and they think like, okay, this is what I have. Now I'm going to be okay. Not even, and now I'm going to take whatever it is that they give me or whatever, and not even really realizing that it's really there's a deeper rooted issue there and there are ways to heal. There are absolutely ways to heal, like 100% of the time, pretty much.
Yeah, it's truly amazing.
It is. So as we sort of dive into today's topics, which, largely surround women's hormone health, but particularly we're going to be talking about PCOS and endometriosis as well, and then sort of like circle around these two concerns, these two areas. And we see so much of this today. It's gnarly how much, yeah, when you speak to women, how much these terms are just floating around as if like, every third woman is dealing with something like this. So first of all, for those people who might not be aware, let's first define, if you could just define for us what PCOS is, and then also, is it as common as people are saying? Because it certainly seems like it is. And what's the deal with it overall? Because I think there's a lot of misconceptions here.
Yeah. So the first definition I want to offer is not what you would find if you're going to like go on ChatGPT or go online and see like what's PCOS. PCOS is 100% reversible lifestyle condition that is currently affecting huge swaths of women. Like some estimates say 15%. I think it could potentially be higher percent of women, and is the number one leading cause of infertility today. A more like clinical definition would be polycystic ovarian syndrome. And it's a little tricky when we talk about it because approximately 70% of people who are dealing with PCOS, it is like a very clear metabolic issue rooted in the way like producing too much insulin and the way that influences insulin receptors on the ovaries and also can interfere with hormones in the liver. And so can like kind of in a roundabout way cause you to create too much testosterone. But there are typically three factors that a doctor is going to be looking at if you are going to have PCOS. The first one is that you're having symptoms of too much androgen. So, things like hair on your face where like women typically aren't growing that, acne, missing periods, things like that. You'll also oftentimes have those elevated levels of androgen. So elevated testosterone levels, you might be missing your period is a really common way that people know that they're having PCOS is they don't have a regular period. And sometimes I'll see that a lot with people who are not also having those other symptoms. And then another one is it's like, this is where it gets a little bit tricky. I have so many people who come to me and they're like, I was diagnosed with PCOS because they did an ultrasound and they saw cysts on my ovaries. That is not an official way to diagnose PCOS. It is like an old way. If your doctor is still diagnosing PCOS with that ultrasound, like exclusively, that is not a valid diagnosis. But just kind of like we were talking about with IBS is like kind of that like bucket diagnosis.
Yeah.
I think PCOS is a little bit like that. We definitely do see like there are certain more, but it's mostly a collection of symptoms that leads to then this diagnosis.
Okay. Okay. That makes a lot of sense. And it's funny. I love the fact that you said, I'm going to give you two versions of what PCOS is, because it is so true. I think when we want to know something, our go-to is to look it up. But in reality, I think that like what we read versus maybe what is truly going on or what we really need to be aware of or informed about regarding this quote unquote condition is totally two different things, especially still in today's world. And I love the fact that there's so much information out here and there are people like you that are really giving like the truth about these conditions, but it's still so hard. I think when you just get these labels or these diagnoses from medical professionals and then that's it, right? Like there's no like and
Yeah. Well, and it's just so interesting. Like I have a client that I'm working with right now who's had just like, you know, all the things like hypothyroidism, PCOS, issues with cortisol, mold toxicity, all the things. And she was talking about it. And, we've been addressing a lot of these things at the root for a long time. And she's seen a lot of improvement and she's having a regular period every month and all of these things. And she was like saying, da 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 da, my PCOS. And I was like, wait, hold on just a second. You don't have PCOS anymore. And I think this is like that thing where like we get labeled with something, like slapped a diagnosis on. And in that conventional system, that means like, okay, you have this thing forever. Like we technically only treat it if you want to get pregnant, and you're going to treat it either with birth control if you don't want to get pregnant or with metformin if you do. And like you have this condition forever. Whereas like I'm really interested in like how do we take away that label and just really look at like if your body is functioning the way it's supposed to, it is reversible. You no longer have PCOS.
right, exactly. I love that you brought that up. Actually, that's brought up a lot on this show in general. Just the fact that we get wrapped up in these, and sometimes they can be helpful. I understand that. When you're suffering for so long, and I have personal experience here, when you're suffering for so long, or you're so desperate for answers, and somebody gives you an answer, or you get the lab work, or you do the thing, or you get the ultrasound, and you're like, finally, like this is something that I can tangibly look at, right? I get it. I get it. We're all human, and that is something that I think makes a difference. But it's that second piece that I think is so critical. And that's the system's fault, because the system is designed to keep you a patient, unfortunately, and not, we're in a system that is really just like a sick care situation, and not something like, hey, we're gonna work to address this from the root up, and we're gonna get to the bottom of it so you don't have to live with this for the rest of your life. That's not happening. It's really not. I mean, if it is within the conventional system, and no shade to doctors, it's rare. It's rare, and more people are waking up to that. But I still think that it's rare in the conventional paradigm.
For sure.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So I've heard you talk about the fact that there are several types of PCOS, and again, this probably is not something that someone's doctor is going to sit with them and discuss, which I think is really, I don't know, a disservice. But I think that, I heard you speak about the four types, and I think it's really crucial that we go through those because it helps sort of categorize things for people. If they are someone or a woman is listening and thinking that they have something, or maybe they've been living with something and they've never heard this information. So, can you go through briefly the four types?
Absolutely. And I think it's so important too, because speaking to what we were just talking about, like a lot of people will have this diagnosis and be doing a conventional treatment for it. And it's not either not working or it's not providing the results that they think it should. And it might be because you're not treating the right type and not addressing it in the right way. So, yes, absolutely. So, there are four types of PCOS, like you just mentioned. The first one, and I'm kind of going to do it in like a little bit of like how common they are and like a flow chart option. So the first one is insulin resistance based PCOS. And now this is the PCOS that everyone knows about. Okay. This is the primary slash like depending on who you're talking to in the conventional space, like the only type of PCOS they're really addressing. And this person is going to have issues with their blood sugar regulation. Okay. And so if you are not someone who, it's something like 40 to 80%, which that's like a huge percentage change, but 40 to 80% of people with PCOS will struggle with obesity, with their weight, and things like that. And so then those fall into this category. It's estimated that about 70% of people with PCOS have this type of PCOS. So 7 out of 10, that's a big type. Now, it is possible to fall into multiple of these categories. But so like if you're like, oh, that's totally me, but then the next one is totally me too, there might be a little bit of like a chicken and the egg situation. But if you have metabolic issues, metabolic conditions, you're most likely in this first type. Now, if you're like, okay, that doesn't really apply to me, this is oftentimes what's sometimes called skinny PCOS, is when we're moving into some of these other types, because PCOS historically had such a connotation with having issues with your weight. And so when someone would have PCOS but not have, issues with their weight or not have metabolic issues, it was like dubbed skinny PCOS. But what we're really actually calling it, so the second most common type of PCOS is inflammation-based PCOS. And so these people tend to have other inflammation issues. So like they're the ones who've had stomach issues, throughout their life, or maybe they have issues around in their joints. I most commonly see GI issues go alongside this type of PCOS, but there's some reason that there's inflammation in the body that is causing PCOS in this person. The third most common type, which we're getting less common the further we go down, is post-pill PCOS. So this is just after getting off of hormonal birth control, what ends up happening. So you've been suppressing testosterone while you're on contraceptives. And then you come off of it and you get this boomerang effect where it's like whoosh and hits you back. And that overloading of androgens will cause androgen-like symptoms that mimic PCOS and can actually, again, PCOS is just this collection of symptoms, right? So then we'll show that someone has PCOS. And this is really common, again, as more and more women are on hormonal birth control come off, and will often be addressed with things like in the conventional space, like spironolactone or things like that to just, again, come back and suppress that testosterone. And then the fourth type of PCOS is the least common. It's estimated that about 10% of people have this. And so could be less. We don't 100% know. And this is adrenal PCOS. And in this one, this person, the only androgen levels that they have that are elevated are DHEA-S. And so it's a specific form. DHEA is the precursor to testosterone and to those androgenic hormones. And so they're not usually presenting with the same symptoms as everyone else, but they're still not having regular cycles. And they're just having, some of these other like wonky side effects, like, like the polycystic ovaries or things like that, but they're not presenting the way that the other three typically do with some of those really strong androgen symptoms. And it's only because it's in their adrenals.
Got it. Got it. And you said that this can overlap. So, what would you say to someone who's listening to this going, gosh, I kind of almost feel like I fit into two or three of those categories?
Yeah. So, I find this breakdown the most valuable for helping someone get to their root cause, right? And so the thing is, even if you are not in that first category and you're like, okay, but I'm a healthy weight and I'm an active person, et cetera, it's estimated that only 6% of Americans are actually metabolically healthy. So no matter how like on paper healthy someone looks when they come to work with me, we're always working on blood sugar balance no matter what. So I would say, like, if you feel like you fall into that category and another one, great. Like, that just gives you more opportunities to adopt more healthy habits to support yourself. So like, I would say no matter what, if you think you fall in two categories, still work on your blood sugar balance, because that's like the foundation for all systems in your body. And it probably could use a little bit of support, even if that's like not your primary cause of PCOS.
Yeah.
And then I would say, in some ways, like if you're feeling like you really fall into two or three of these categories, trust your instincts and your gut, because let's say you were on hormonal birth control. We know that can influence things that cause inflammation in your body. So it's like you definitely could be coming off the pill and have inflammation and have blood sugar issues. But we kind of want to work on them in like that triage order. So start with working on your blood sugar issues, right? And then like integrate in looking into what's causing inflammation in your body. And then if you're already off of the pill in this situation, so that's good. But
Yeah. Yeah. You know, I'm sitting here listening to you and I'm thinking, gosh, she's really describing me. When I was coming off of, let's see, I probably came off the pill around 28 years old, maybe. And I never had, I guess, like I never had a diagnosis of PCOS or endo or anything of that nature. And I still to this day, you know, and I where I have seen hormonal fluctuations or some issues here and there that are purely inflammation based, I'm almost surprised that I didn't go down the route of being diagnosed with something like PCOS, because I had been on the pill for 10 years. I was dealing with inflammation already, and then I bounced off of the pill, right? And I did not, thank God. I mean, I did not see myself at the doctor's office complaining about the symptoms. I'm so grateful for that. But I imagine that's very, 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 well, I don't want to say not common, but it's so common, unfortunately, to see people who do have these symptoms. And I want to ask you, for someone who's listening that might not have the experience, or maybe they, you know, maybe there's, I don't know, maybe a man's listening and he's thinking about his wife. I mean, you know, there's a vast array of people that listen to this show. What are some of the primary symptoms that someone would complain about if they are dealing with PCOS?
yeah. So the first one that's the most common is a missing period, right? Like if you are not having cycles that are coming every 35 days or less. So like typically when we see cycles that are over 35 days, those tend to be anovulatory cycles, meaning that ovulation did not occur. So a period is a cycle in which ovulation occurs. So like if you are having really irregular cycles, like a lot of PCOS, you know, women with PCOS will say like, I bleed every 50 or so days, or maybe they're going longer than that. So having really irregular or missing periods is, I think, the most common symptom that alerts people like, hey, something's wrong.
Yeah.
The second one is acne, and like acne that's either cystic or typically right around that jawline, which is more of that testosterone based acne. Another one is, again, we talked about this briefly, but like that facial hair growth,
Yeah.
right? And just
Yeah.
like, you know, seeing hair in places that women typically don't get dark hair. Like it's normal to have peach fuzz on
Yeah.
your face, but like dark, thicker hair growing on your face. And then also, oftentimes these symptoms, again, these ones can be more linked to other things, but could be like stubbornness, losing weight, right? And just feeling like, I work out all the time. I have a personal trainer. I eat really clean, but nothing changes. It's probably due to there's some metabolic dysfunction or insulin resistance. So I would say those are like the most
Those are the
common
most common. Most common.
PCOS symptoms.
Would you say that these women who are you know diagnosed with this condition or think they have this condition also are in pain during their menstruation?
Not typically. I mean, it maybe like it's possible that they have some cramping, but it's not usually that associated. And sometimes that's because they're not having cycles very frequently, right? And so, like, one of the reasons that we will actually see that in the conventional system, they give progesterone or hormonal birth control to women with PCOS is to help them shed their endometrial lining so that it doesn't build up and build up and build up, which causes or can potentially create more risk for cancer. So, it's to help them shed that. And so a lot of times they'll have very few symptoms because their hormones are not being dominated by some of those more like inflammatory female hormones when they become out of balance, like estrogen.
That makes total sense. That makes total sense. And you mentioned this earlier, but I just want to, stamp the envelope for those who, just to be super clear about it. So in the conventional paradigm, if you were to go into a doctor and you were to get diagnosed with PCOS, the primary forms of quote unquote treatment would be birth control. So typically the pill and or metformin. Would it be or would it be?
Yeah, it really, I think, varies on the doctor that you're seeing. And so usually hormonal like contraceptive pills are the most common treatment that I see, but I think today there's been a little bit more awareness that there are a lot of risks associated with that medication and a lot of more people, at least that I'm seeing now in my orbit, who are like, okay, but I want to like have a baby in a year. So then what am I going to do about it? Right. And so we'll see hormonal birth control be a very common option, but also metformin or spironolactone. And I typically see like spironolactone, which is a testosterone suppressor, is more commonly prescribed when someone is primarily complaining about like the acne, or some of those other symptoms that are just like more in your face, pun intended, right? Like on in and on your face. And it's like a vanity reason. And I have full respect for people who want to deal with that in whatever way they want to deal with it. But I'll typically see that come up more frequently with the spironolactone. The metformin, I commonly see more if people are like dealing with more issues with their weight, because it is a diabetes medication. And then the birth control is a little bit more of a catch-all. And then lastly, the only other medication that is sometimes prescribed is, this is more common if someone is trying to conceive, is something like Clomid, which will help someone ovulate, because that would be then the treatment for it. Yeah.
Got it. Got it. Well, kind of a random off the cuff question, but do you find that women come to see you or just reach out for help in general later than they should, because it is like, okay, now I want to start to try to conceive, or now I'm thinking about having a family, but they've been suffering or they've been dealing, or maybe they've been mildly dealing with these symptoms for a long time, but now say maybe they've gone, say 9, 10, 11 months or 2 years or whatever it is, and they haven't been able to conceive, and then they're going, okay, wait, now something is wrong, or the fact that I've bled every 50 days is probably not the best thing, even though I kind of felt like it was convenient, to some degree. Do you find that common at all?
I do. I do. I find it really common and it breaks my heart. There's so much that we can do in the preconception phase. And I love when I get to see people when they're like a year, 2 years out from wanting that journey. But I find what so often happens is like either they've been dealing with this and they think that the birth control they've been on is now treating it. And then they come off of it to discover, oh, actually, this was just masking my symptoms and maybe making them actually worse. Right. So there's that I see all the time. And then there's like, well, I didn't even know I had an issue until I was trying to conceive and realizing, oh, shoot, I'm not ovulating. Right. So if anyone is listening to this and is thinking about wanting to conceive in the next couple of years, whether or not you have PCOS or endometriosis or whatever it is, like now is the best time to set your body up and your children up for health and success during that season. Because yeah, I do see that all the time. I'm thinking specifically of a woman that I actually met in a new moms group. And so, she and I had already had children, and she had PCOS, didn't discover it until she was trying to conceive, ended up going through IVF to get pregnant, and decided to work with me to get pregnant with a second baby, when her first was a little over a year old. And what was really beautiful about this process, but still like kind of broke my heart, is, we did like approximately 6 months of protocols and things like that. And she got her period and she was like having, good success, but was only willing to give it like 2 months of really like trying to get pregnant naturally before it was like, oh, we have these embryos, we want to use them. What's beautiful is she actually didn't have to do a medicated IVF cycle. like for the first time, her hormones did everything they were supposed to do on their own. And so she was able to not have to use any medications when having the IVF cycle, which is like really awesome and a huge testament to how her body was changing. And I like so deeply know that if we had had more space and time, that she likely would have not needed to, use IVF at all. And so whatever, I mean, she already had the embryos, like I get it, but I just think it's an interesting case study to see like time is valuable when it comes to our bodies and healing and hormones and fertility. And it's never a bad idea to try and give yourself more of it.
Yeah, yeah. Wow, that's a whole show just in itself, it really is.
Sure.
And I feel as though, and again, this is a whole nother show in itself, what I'm about to say. So I'm going to probably just say it briefly and then we'll move on. Otherwise it'll be like a hole that we jump, we jump, we jump through. Yep. Yep. We will not find ourselves out of it. But I wonder often actually, how many women go down the IVF route or just they go to other means, right? When they don't have to. And I find that statistic, if I could guess, is probably so astronomically high. And it's probably not even a statistic that like we can actually measure because who's measuring it, right? Like, does that make sense?
Totally. And I think IVF is a beautiful tool. Like I've worked with some clients who it was absolutely the best option for them and for them to build their family. And there's a lot that we can do to help them be more successful in IVF. I mean, I think that's the part about IVF that people don't talk about too, is that you can have like 10 rounds of IVF and still not be successful, right?
Right.
It's not perfect and so I mean I love getting to support people who are doing that and having more successful cycles. And caveat here, like I definitely think it's overused, and there's also risks that are associated with it that we're not talking about. I mean, there's like a lot of increased risk of estrogen dominant cancers and thing I see in my practice all the time, people who've gone through IVF who are having issues with copper toxicity and other issues from having too much estrogen. And so, yeah, totally could be a whole nother
Yeah.
topic, but I think it's definitely something that people jump to when there's so much that you can do to support your fertility naturally.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. And it is, you're right. It's a whole nother topic. And it's also, and again, like I'm going to say this with the preempt of this is not something that's insensitive. So when I say IVF is a really big business, it is a very, very big business. And that doesn't, I don't say that to, hey, if it has helped people that, and I know it has, then like you said, that's a beautiful thing. But it's also something I think that doctors often jump to because it's a tool in their toolbox, and it's like, wait, though, like our bodies are designed to heal and our bodies are designed if we just spend a little bit more time or if we just investigate a little bit further, I'm sure that there could be other means to get to where, you want to be, which is ultimately pregnant for many families.
For sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's like oil and gas is a big business, and we're like, we all still, it's like
Yes.
we're all saved by when ambulances can get where they need to go because they have gas in the tank. Like it's not, yeah, it doesn't necessarily make it a bad thing. It just, I all the time see, I mean, I remember I had a client once who had gone through so many rounds of IVF. Her doctors had told her husband that he could have bought a private island with the amount of money these people had spent on IVF. I mean, like over six figures, and had nothing to show for it. Like they didn't have any embryos that they were going to be able to use. They didn't have a baby. And I looked at this woman's food journal and I started to cry. And I said to her, I didn't cry in front of her. I looked at it in private and, before in my pre-prep for for my call with her. And when I said to her, your doctors have never talked to you about like diet, with the hundreds of thousands of dollars that you spend on IVF. And they had her on a bunch of supplements and stuff. No, never. And it's like, if you're going to be charging people $50,000, for the process, maybe you should tell them to stop eating Cheetos. Like, I mean, seriously, like that's a small example, but I do think that it is a big business, and it doesn't mean that it's not a beautiful, helpful business, but that it doesn't make doctors any money if they tell you to go home and eat a whole foods diet and manage your stress and maybe do a few $100 gut tests to see if you have something that's causing inflammation or a specific bacteria in the gut that's associated with unexplained infertility.
You said it. You said it. Okay. There it
Yeah.
is. Yep, it's true. I mean, it doesn't, it's, yep. We
Yeah.
can, you said it and now we can move on. Because
I know.
that's exactly
TBD.
it. Yep.
We'll have another episode to go on.
Exactly. Yeah, we could go. We'll see part two coming soon, friends. So as we sort of, it's, I mean, it's definitely a segue into and just another version of, because I feel like at the end of the day, when we are discussing these conditions, it really is just our body's out of balance and wants to come back into balance. But I do want to quickly go through because you kind of hear PCOS and endometriosis, they're clumped together, and I don't mean clumped together like the same thing. I just mean they're clumped together when we're talking about fertility and we're talking about hormonal problems. And a lot of experts out there are like, oh, I'm a PCOS and endometriosis expert or so forth. So and there's probably a good grip of people who are listening who have dealt with endometriosis. So, can we quickly go down that lane for a bit and talk a little bit about endo and what it
Sure.
is, what the symptoms are, how it's diagnosed, and kind of what the deal is there, both in the conventional and then the functional space?
Yeah. So endometriosis is a condition, and it's a condition in the functional space that I feel like we are learning a lot more about. Some people are thinking that it's maybe a bit like related to autoimmunity. And I mean, it's a little bit more of like a question mark in terms of an unknown compared to PCOS, especially in the functional space as we're learning more. But what is happening with with endometriosis is that cells that are very similar to those in your endometrial lining, which we talked about, right, will grow outside of the uterus and can cause unbelievable pain and issues for women who are having cycles and have endometriosis. It is hard to diagnose, and so it's likely underdiagnosed, like very underdiagnosed. Technically, like you need to have like a laparoscopic surgery to diagnose it, and so it's not very common. And it's, the biggest symptoms are really heavy bleeding and painful periods. People can also have really painful periods without having endometriosis. Also, sometimes it can be confused with fibroids depending on what's going on in someone's body. The conventional treatment for it is typically surgery, to remove those growths that are outside of the uterus, because the issue with endometriosis is also like an estrogen dominance issue, but all of that tissue that makes that exists like in almost like little growths outside of the uterus make more estrogen. So it's like an ecosystem where like it's constantly making more estrogen. And I will say, like, even in the functional space, there's a lot we can do on the preventative side. And there's also a lot we can do, like when we learn someone has endometriosis, to ask why and then like look a little bit deeper. And if endometriosis has gotten to the place where it's like very advanced, surgery is still likely a good option. It's a little bit, I haven't successfully seen it like completely be reversed once it's in those more advanced stages.
Do doctors point people towards heredity? Like, is this hereditary for people, or what is typically being said about that?
Yeah, I think it's, it's always hard for me as a functional practitioner to think about like nature versus nurture, because like, is it genes hereditary or is it epigenetic expression? And so like we are given this blueprint that says you are more likely to have issues with like excess estrogens and detoxing estrogens, and then your environment was similar to that of your mom's, right? You grew up eating the same foods and you grew up in the same house with the same perfumes and all these things, and that like enhanced your estrogen. So yes and no. I mean, I think that like it's possible definitely to have a more genetic predisposition to it. And like I said, like this was part of why I was so nervous about my own fertility, because my aunt, had endometriosis and it caused her to have to go to IVF to use her to have children. But I also think that it's a lot of like, well, the nurture is part of how those genes express themselves. And if that's similar to the way that our the people before us who also passed down our genes lived, then that also makes sense.
Yeah, I think that's like that with most things, don't you think? I mean, it's a pretty small percentage, I think, when the genetic component is super high, like I mean, there are rare instances, I think, with people across the world where they have something that they came out with it potentially. It was passed on in the womb and they came out with it. Or, I'm sure there's instances. I mean, I'm not really super familiar, but most things I think are sort of like what triggered those genes to turn on, you know?
Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
absolutely. And like we're currently living in a very estrogenic environment.
Oh,
Um, like on so many levels, just the xenoestrogens in our environment are putting a massive load on the body. And I think that is a large reason that we are seeing more of the endometriosis these days. And some people do have genetic predispositions to being less capable of detoxing those excess estrogens. And so I think to some extent, like those genetic, like we know like that the MTHFR gene is like a gene that's passed down in our genome, right?
yeah.
And so I think that there is that like component of, well, maybe someone is going to then be more susceptible to something like this. And then we can use that information to just support your estrogen detox. And that's like one of the reasons why I love the Dutch test so much, is because it doesn't just show us what hormones are present or that you have estrogen dominance, but it shows us those metabolites and how you're breaking them down. And that plays such a huge role in it too. And so, I mean, I think it's amazing with what the modern data that we have. We're able to really get insight into someone's unique estrogen breaking down capacity, and do you have a genetic predisposition like MTHFR, and at the same time, like the modern world is just so estrogen dominant that we need to be able to use those tools.
So true. That's so true. And it kind of flows right into what I was going to go into next, which is, because I want to talk a little bit about, well, a couple things I want to talk about. I want to talk a little bit about the gut and how the gut plays such a primary role in both of these concerns, endo and PCOS, and really just everything, really. I mean, truly everything. And then I also want to go back and circle back into birth control for a bit. But it is absolutely so true because we live in a very tough world. And I'm not, I say this all the time. I'm not saying it to like freak people out or for people to be paranoid about it. And oh, I can't do anything and I can't ever go out and I can't ever eat in a restaurant and I can't. No, but we are living in so much toxicity, and if you already have an issue with methylation or with detoxification, your liver's already living in the world, and then you've got something on top of it, or you've got some gut issues. I mean, it just becomes so difficult. It's almost like, how can you not deal with estrogen dominance? How do you not have it? Because we've got so much stacked up against us. But I think, again, awareness is the first step.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So speaking of gut and detox and all that, let's talk a little bit about the gut. And we've done a deep dive on gut health on this show, but in relation to specifically hormone health and specifically these concerns, PCOS, endo, why is the state of your gut, your digestive system and everything that's encompassing, why is it so crucial to look at that when you have a concern like PCOS or endometriosis?
So I love to say that poop problems become period problems. And it's just like a fun little way of, reminding us how much of a role the gut plays when it comes to hormones. And there's a few different ways that this plays out. And so the first one that I want to talk about is really coming down to that poop problems. And so for people who have issues with constipation, and also just a reminder that constipation, you can still poop every day and be constipated. I have my clients do a sesame seeds test where they swallow sesame seeds when they're eating breakfast, and we wait to see how long it takes for it to show up in their stool. And when it shows up in your stool, like 18 to 24 hours later, you're good to go. If it takes longer than that, it means like even that your transit time is too slow. So I'll have clients that are pooping every day, but we do the sesame seeds test and it's 48 hours or 72 hours until we see those seeds, meaning that they're not eliminating within 24 hours. So you're still constipated. So this is like a really easy DIY test you can do at home. Super, super scientifically advanced. But yeah, really like when we are struggling with slow transit time, so constipation, what ends up happening is that the body reabsorbs toxins, but also hormones and has to recycle them. So if we're thinking about estrogen and thinking about estrogen dominance or endometriosis, right? If we're not eliminating yesterday's estrogens that are used, processed through the liver, sent through the bile, through the stool, and supposed to be pooped out, and our body absorbs them and has to process it again, not only are we processing yesterday's or today's estrogen, but we're also processing yesterday's. And if we add that up over and over, then we end up in a situation where we have too much estrogen and an overburdened liver, right? Because it's having to process yesterday's and today's toxins and hormones. So not having a good transit time can really set you up for challenges when it comes to hormone balance, especially if we're looking at some of the like estrogen dominant symptoms. So that's one way. Now, the question is, well, why does someone have a slow transit time? So that oftentimes comes down to either digestive capacity and like maybe the body is like really struggling to digest food properly, maybe as a result of gut infections or dysbiosis. So an imbalance of good and bad bacteria in the gut. And now this is where it gets really interesting when it comes to hormone balance too, because we know that there are approximately 3 pounds of bacteria that use our gut as a home and use us. I know, isn't that kind of like creepy if you think about it?
3 pounds. I mean, think about like, I don't know, those small weights or
Yes,
you know what I mean? Like that, if you, that's, I mean, okay, like it's not like a 20-pound weight. I get it, but 3 pounds is still pretty legit.
it's definitely something that will keep you up at night if you're thinking about it in the wee hours of the morning. Like, okay, there's a lot of like living bugs in my body.
That's a lot of weight for
Totally.
for things that are so microscopic.
Totally.
Wow.
Billions and billions and billions of them.
Wow.
And
Wow.
so we
Wow.
know a little bit about the different communities that these microbes create. And one of these communities is called the estrobolome. And it is a community of gut microbes that are tasked with the job to helping you process and metabolize estrogen. So if we have imbalances in our gut bacteria, our gut is supposed to be a very diverse ecosystem. And if one part of it is getting wonky, then the whole ecosystem can kind of, right, like get out of whack. And so then that estrobolome as a community might not be doing its job properly. And so we know that these gut microbes play very specific roles in helping us metabolize and detox estrogens. Additionally, there's a specific microbe in the gut called Akkermansia. And it's one that I commonly will see my clients come back either deficient in or overgrown in. And it is the primary bacteria that we've identified that serves a role in metabolic health. So thinking again about that insulin resistance, thinking about blood sugar issues, right? Like how much of that might also be coming from the gut when the gut is tasked with breaking down our food and turning it into energy. There's a huge role that we play there. And so a lot of times we can look at like what we call like skinny and fat bugs in the gut. And there are certain like we have Firmicutes and Bacteroides, and Firmicutes, which are a family of gut bacteria. And I'm kind of nerding out for a second here.
Please do. I love
Or a
this.
family of gut bacteria that don't absorb all of every calorie. So like if you're eating and you have a good amount, eating, let's say 2000 calories a day, whatever, and your Firmicutes is robust and it's this big phyla in your gut and it doesn't need to absorb all of the calories to do what it needs to do, you're not going to need as much of those calories and you pass them on them. But if your Bacteroides is overgrown, they absorb every calorie. They absorb all of it. So like a lot of times we'll see that Firmicutes be low, Bacteroides be high, and these people are really struggling with their weight, no matter the fact that they're eating really clean, right?
Interesting.
And thinking about the ways in which like Akkermansia as this like specific role in metabolic health and as these like skinny and fat, gut bugs are playing a role, all influence the way that our body is metabolically functioning. Right. And so then that can really play a role in does someone have metabolic issues that are contributing to PCOS? And then lastly, coming back to that inflammation piece, right? The second most common type of PCOS is that inflammatory PCOS, and almost all inflammation starts in the gut.
Got it. Yeah.
And so, we really see how these issues are rooted in the gut. Hippocrates said, I mean, thousands of years ago, all disease begins in the gut, and he wasn't wrong. And so, hormone imbalance, I mean, a lot of times in my practice, I don't test hormones to start. And people are so confused by that. They're like, you specialize in hormones. Like, how are we not doing a Dutch test when we get started? And I say to them, it'll really validate how you feel. And if you want to pay $370, to have your feelings validated, I'm all for it. But that hormone imbalance doesn't tell us anything about the root cause of why you have that hormone imbalance.
Yeah.
And 7 out of 10 times we're seeing it in the gut.
Wow. Wow. Would you say, okay, first of all, I loved all of that so much. That was amazing. You can nerd out some more because that was fantastic. And I learned a few new things. Would you say that people who, okay, put it this way. What if someone is sitting here listening and they're thinking, well, I have these hormone issues, but I don't have any gut symptoms. So what do you have to say about that?
A lot.
Yeah.
I can tell you that the worst case of leaky gut I've ever seen was with someone who had not a single gut issue. And for her, it was manifesting all as immune issues. And like just a reminder that gut issues look really different. Like they're not always like stomach aches and diarrhea, right? It can be immune issues. It can be like we're seeing it neurologically. So, presenting as brain fog or ADHD. We can also see it as just like like that inflammation sending outwards. So like feeling inflammation in your joint. It can show up as histamine issues, right? So like feeling like you always kind of have a stuffy nose or a runny nose, or like you as skin issues, right? There are so many other ways that gut issues manifest beyond I get bloated after I eat or whatever it is. And that's the biggest misconception that holds people back from actually exploring what they need to explore to heal themselves
I think
or not even heal, but just optimize.
Yeah, this is a really important point, I think. And that's also something that I think we all need to consider because we might have other issues, myself included. We might have other issues or other inflammatory, things going on, and we might not have gut symptoms, or we might think, well, I go to the restroom every day, or my stools are fairly normal, but I have, that reminds me of I had, okay, so when we did a gut show on this, or a gut episode on the show, I had a practitioner. Her name was Kim, and really great practitioner on IBS and gut health. And she didn't really have a whole lot of gut symptoms, but she had horrific migraines for over a decade, something like 15 years. And she was on like 7 different medications, and her life, they were like, your life is going to be like this for the rest of your life. And she would not take no for an answer. And so she went to the gut, even though she didn't really have symptoms of the gut. And that is what fixed the migraine issue.
It's amazing. Yeah.
Yeah.
I've
Yeah.
seen that before too. And another one that, I mean, I think people sort of put these two together, but like food sensitivities.
Mm,
I see a lot of times people are like, oh, I don't have, any gut issues, but I can't eat X, Y, and Z because of this. Like that's also kind of an obvious sign that your gut is reacting to something.
yeah. So, would you say that most people, this is a really big, strange, not strange, but it's kind of a broad question. Let's just stick with women for now. Do you feel like most women would probably benefit from doing some sort of dive into their gut? Just regardless of symptoms, regardless of issue?
Yes, I do. And the way that I explain this to people is like, we have totally normalized that you go to a primary care physician every year for like a wellness check, and you get a run up of all this blood work that tells you nothing,
Nothing.
nothing. It's like amazing to me how little information we get from doing that, right? Maybe your cholesterol is trending a little bit high, which like could go into a whole nother topic about that. I think
Yep.
high cholesterol is amazing.
Yep.
And they're like, stop eating meat. Like you get literally no information from this. What if we actually did wellness checks that gave us insight into what's going on in our body. And I actually have an alumni program where yearly we do mineral tests and we do gut tests, even if things are going well, right? To just see where you're at so that you can thrive, because this actually gives us information on digestive function, on liver capacity, on these gut bacteria that are constantly changing because we're in contact with things all the time. Maybe you get food poisoning. Maybe get go travel somewhere and you pick something up. I don't want to wait 10 years for us to see it, right? Like we want to get this information. And so, yes, I think even if you're like, well, I feel great, there's so much that you can gain. And I've never seen a GI map come back perfect. Like on a first test, like on someone who's just like, oh, I've never done this before. There's always something that we can improve. And it doesn't mean that it requires a lot of time or effort or work, but maybe because we're catching it then, it's not going to turn into something bigger 5 years down the line. And so even on the ones that I have that come back like relatively easy, as far as like things to deal with, those are a blessing and that's great. It's so great that we found them. But more often than not, I definitely find things that we can use to improve. And then people end up being like, oh my God, I didn't realize that I didn't have enough energy, or I didn't have, this wasn't working as well in my body. Fill in the blanks. I mean, it can be connected to any minor symptom that you don't even know is connected.
Yeah. Yeah. It's so true. It is so true. And I think,
And
oh, go ahead. Go ahead, please.
right, just this last point, like specifically women, I mean, also men, but like we are passing now, we know more about the microbiome for children. And it was believed that like babies were being fully inoculated at birth and like that they were getting all of that from the vaginal microbiome, which we are getting. Like children do get a huge amount of their bacteria colonizing from that. But now we know that the inside of the womb is not sterile and that they're actually, once they start swallowing amniotic fluid, which happens around, like that halfway point, they're starting to be inoculated with the bacteria from mom. And so like the best thing you can do to set your kid up for health is to give them a good gut health from the beginning. And so like doing these tests in advance of having babies is such an amazing benefit. Again, even if you don't think you have gut issues, like let's make sure that your microbiome looks awesome before you start passing it on to children.
Yeah, I think it's real solid advice and something that, and I'm sure there are people listening that are probably like, well, shoot, I wish I would have known this 14 or 15 years ago. And it's fine, you guys. Like, we do the best we can with what we know at the time, but it is really exceptional advice, I think, for those maybe who are a little bit younger or a little bit, earlier on in their journey, if they want to have children. To start thinking about some of these proactive things that they could do, whether or not they have severe symptoms or not, like you said.
And just setting yourself up for like perimenopause, menopause, all of these things, we know how connected it is. Like inflammation is just going to add fuel to that fire of changes. And so, yes, I mean, it's never too early and it's never too late, in my opinion, to really just get some insight into what's going on in your body.
I agree. I agree so much. Makes me think I need to think more about this too, because it's been a while since I've actually done some testing, like some legit testing, but we could talk about that later. We'll talk about that off air. So, this sort of has to do with the gut, not just the gut, but I do want to wrap back around to, PCOS real quick, and birth control being the primary tool that is used in the conventional space to quote unquote treat. Now, obviously, a lot of people by now know that the birth control pill does not come without risk, but the amount of risk is still not really spoken about. And I think that it also has a massive, because it did for me, a massive impact on the gut and the microbiome. Let's talk a little bit about that before we go into some solution-based things, and we'll talk a little bit about cycle syncing and things like that. But let's talk a little bit about the birth control pill as it relates to the gut, and also whatever else you want to share about risk benefit.
Yeah, I am maybe a little bit of an unpopular opinion. I really think there's like very few benefits, like almost no
Same.
benefits to hormonal birth control with what we know about it now. And the risks are astronomical. I mean, increasing your risk depending on, which studies we're looking at, but like up to 4 to 10x fold for conditions like IBS and IBD, Crohn's, colitis. If you take the birth control pill for 6 months, it increases your risk of like 50% for getting diabetes in menopause, like once you're in menopause. And this, I'm saying this as someone who took this medication for 10 years before I knew any of this, And so, like, it can feel hard to hear some of these statistics sometimes. And it's amazing to me that, like, this isn't discussed more, for sure. It also causes mineral imbalances and nutrient deficiencies. Again, most of these minerals and which are so important for pregnancy. And so there's that. There are also recent studies that show that people who conceive within 6 months of having been on oral contraceptives have their children have higher risks of cancer.
Wow.
And like, we're just not even beginning to understand some of these potential implications of this medication. And so, like, the just get off of it right before you want to get pregnant advice is like probably the worst advice you could ever give someone. You need to give yourself at least a year being off of hormonal birth control. Seriously, it is like not advised to stay on it longer. And that's where we kind of play with the risk benefit thing. It's just, I think that there are so many unknowns around like what potentially some of these risks are. I mean, we do know it plays a role in everything from gut health to metabolic dysfunction. Another one that I didn't chat about yet, but the risk for mental health issues and depression and anxiety is so high. I can't tell you just anecdotally in my practice how often, when I'm doing an intake with someone and they're telling me about the medications that they take. And first of all, it's crazy that 25% of, young of women today are taking some sort of SSRI or anti-anxiety medication. Like, that is not normal. But how often I'll be going through my protocol, my intake with people, and they say, okay, like, I started birth control when I was 17, and then when I was 18 I went on Lexapro. And I'm like, did anyone ever tell you about that connection? I can't even tell you, Vanessa, how often I see that. It is like the 1-2 punch. Get on birth control, within a year, get on some sort of anti-anxiety medication. There was a documentary called The Business of Birth Control, and they go into some of this, and it's crazy, like, how much that can impact emotional well-being.
I bet. I bet. I actually, looking back, I mean, it's been a long time, but looking back, I could see how it probably impacted me in terms of mental and emotional. And also, it's interesting too. This is kind of a weird symptom, or I should say a weird thing that occurs, but doesn't it also impact the way that we potentially our attraction levels, like our attraction to men or like who we pick as a mate?
Yes, it interferes with um, basically like our ability to, it's kind of weird, but to smell the right partner. And so, like,
Pheromones.
so much, yeah, like so much of this is very primal. And not only are we not putting out the pheromones that are proper for us. And they've actually done studies on strippers and seen that strippers on hormonal birth control made significantly less money than strippers who were not. And it's because of that pheromone and the ovulation, like what's happening biologically. It's really fascinating. But yes, are totally attracted to men that maybe aren't right for us because of it.
Wow. Yeah, that is, I've read it a few times. I've read that, that note a few times from different studies, or, and different practitioners have mentioned it. And that's so fascinating to me. Also, when I think about this again was something that I dealt with, but I also had, the whole gut birth control connection. I dealt with things like candida, increased parasitic activity, because candida is often, a lot of times that goes hand in hand, and it's like, what comes first, the chicken or the egg? Who knows? But and I'm not saying all parasites are, there's a lot of information out there on parasites, and not, parasites are not all bad. It's just that there was an imbalance, and so things were getting out of control. And so I feel like a lot of women who are on birth control, they will have issues with chronic yeast infections and so forth. So obviously that's going to impact the gut, right?
Absolutely. I mean, I will say, like when we're talking about the risk benefits, like again, not a fan of hormonal birth control in general. The oral contraceptive is worse, arguably, in my opinion, than some of the IUDs that are hormonal because of the way that it processes through the digestive tract, because it does have an increased impact on the gut and digestive system, which then, like we talked about this very briefly before, it's not only masking symptoms, but it's often making them worse, right? So if like inflammation in your gut was the reason that you had PCOS to begin with, right? And then we take this medication every day that hides the symptoms of the PCOS. So we don't, like, we think we're getting better, right? We think we're having a period every month. We think we're doing all these things. And then we get off of it. And not only do we find that it was masking those symptoms, but it also was maybe making them worse because they increased the inflammation in the gut. It's really such a shame.
Ugh.
Yeah.
It's such a cycle. And really, isn't that the case with so many things? It's like when, again, let's go back to the migraine example. Like, okay, you have migraines. Okay, let's take this drug. Well, you're not really treating the migraines. You're minimizing the symptoms, and oftentimes the medication is going to then cause another additional imbalance. Then you're going to need something else for that imbalance, and it's really just this cycle that you get stuck in, and
Whack-a-mole approach. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. And I often say it's not a cycle that's broken by accident, unfortunately. And I'm not saying that I say this every show, so forgive me, friends, but I realize that a lot of doctors are in it to really help people, but the system that they're in and that they're working under is not, and so the toolbox is not complete, because it's really, they just have a set of tools that they have learned, and that's and to know, of course they're going to use what they have. But it's unfortunate because you get wrapped up in this, just merry-go-round of drugs and symptoms and drugs and symptoms and more drugs and then more symptoms, and no one's getting anywhere.
Totally. I mean, for better or worse, have never seen a single person, like not just in my practice, but just that I've ever met in life, who's had a doctor, like a conventional doctor, who's reversed their PCOS. But I've done it 50 plus times, right? Like, I'm not a doctor. It's not like special, like it's not anything super crazy. It's just having the right, not only set of tools, but also incentive, right? Which isn't to see this person more often. Like, my business model is different because it's eventually planned obsolescence, right?
Yeah.
The medical system's model is not planned obsolescence. They want to see you as much as possible. And so even if doctors don't realize that that is like in their,
Yeah. Their
like,
contract.
yeah, but
Yeah.
that's what they're doing. And so, yeah, I agree with you. I think it's just a broken system in that way. And the best way you can get out of it is by becoming your own healer,
That's
right?
right.
And so, like, not accepting the conventional systems approach, getting educated and getting support in what you need. And that's, I mean, I like don't even really like it when people call me a healer, or, like I am a practitioner, but like my purpose is to help you heal yourself. Like, it is for us to create the right environment in your body so that your body can do its own healing, because your body is more wise than me, than your doctor. And like, thank God for, Western medicine. Like, if you were in a car accident or you broke your arm or whatever, like there are so many amazing things that we are so reliant on Western medicine for. And I'm so grateful. But for dealing with chronic illness, they're just not equipped. And like, we need to just remember that your body is the wisest in the room. And so it's really about figuring out, like, well, what is your body telling us? How can I remove as many of these barriers to success, like birth control, like these other medications, right? And just help create that environment for the body to do its own healing.
Exactly. Exactly. I always say this, and I talk about it a lot here and off air, but it's nobody that this is another problem, is I think that people go into situations with doctors or practitioners, be it holistic, functional, or conventional, and think like this person is going to heal me. No. No one is a healer on this earth. I don't care who you are. You might have talent. You might be extremely anointed. You might have gifts, and you might be called to help people, absolutely, but nobody touches the wisdom of our bodies. Nobody touches that. Our bodies are so innately intelligent, and there is something there that we don't even, I don't even think that we really have scratched the surface on just how amazing our bodies are. And given the right environment, to your point, like you said, our bodies will know what to do. They will know what to do, and they are designed to heal, you know? So, I feel like as amazing as practitioners like yourself, you know, like other doctors, we need you guys. We need you. But our bodies just need a little bit of guidance, and they will do the work. You know, they are so absolutely wonderfully made. It's incredible. And so I love that. Um, let's talk as we sort of, you know, wind down a little bit here. Let's talk a little bit about, well, let's just put it this way. If someone's listening, or maybe a mom's listening for their daughter, or, you know, a friend's listening for another friend, and they're like, yeah, you know, this definitely sounds like so and so, where would they start? Because again, we do want to feed our audience with some practical, tangible, actionable steps and solutions. So
Yeah.
where would you point somebody? What direction would you point them in? Where would you have them start? What things should we be thinking about, or what priorities should we be focusing on?
Yeah, I think there's a couple parts to it. I mean, I definitely have seen people be really successful in, taking a lot of the amazing information that is out there in the world from podcasts like this and from books and things like that, and really supporting their body's ability to come back to balance. I mean, if you already have a diagnosis, and so hey, like I'm dealing with PCOS or I'm dealing with endometriosis, there are some really awesome resources. I would say, like, again, when people come to me, I don't actually care if they have a diagnosis or not. Like, it doesn't change the way in which we address it, which is really starting to just look at what is your body saying to us via symptoms, and how do we then answer the call, right? So my first set of advice is pay a lot of attention to your symptoms, get really in touch with your body, and really, like, not just from a perspective of like, oh, my period didn't come this month, but like check in with the little things, like, how do I feel after eating? What's my energy like? Just kind of starting to pay attention to those things, and ask your body, what are you trying to tell me? How can I better support you? Right. And like really start to open up that conversation with your body is a huge, huge avenue to starting to get well. Um, if you have the resources to do so, getting some functional lab testing that really pulls up, the hood of the car of the body, and really starts to look into, well, why, right? If we have inflammation in the body, we oftentimes need to figure out, well, why? And oftentimes I'll see people all the time be like, come to me and they're like, well, I did this gut healing protocol and it didn't work. But oftentimes it's because like their minerals weren't balanced. And so it was never going to work, and so I think finding, if you have the resources to do so, some, either a practitioner to help you with it, or, through other avenues. This is something I do with clients. If you want to talk to me, I'd love to talk to you about it. But looking at some functional labs to figure out the root causes of what's going on, and then start addressing them. I mean, the first thing that I would say for either of these that everyone can start doing at home is like, pay attention to your environment also, right? Like getting rid of the plastics in your environment, getting rid of fragrances, making sure that your products are clean, like cleaning up that environment is a really great first step. Eating real foods, right, that are good for your body, lots of animal fats, lots of protein, making sure that, you're not like getting caught up in the like trends of the green powders and the this and
Right.
the that. And that could go a really long way. But depending on like how long something's been out of balance, sometimes we do need to find those like, okay, like here's the smoking gun of like something that's going on. I'm thinking I have a client who struggled with endometriosis and it was really advanced, and she ended up having surgery. And then after the surgery, she still was having a lot of pain with her cycles. And I got an email from her 2 months ago being like, I just had my first pain-free period. And we were able to identify she had parasites, she had candida, she had all of these things, a lot of which is, the chicken or the egg, but like a lot of that was likely contributing to like more of this imbalanced estrogen environment. And by reducing that inflammation and being able to balance out her estrogen, she's going to be able to succeed. We had worked together years ago before I was doing functional lab testing, and she had less painful periods, but we didn't have the success we wanted to see until we could really get in there and be like, here's the smoking gun. So there's a lot you can do. Clean up your environment, balance your blood sugar by eating more fat and protein, eating that 30 grams of protein in the morning. before, like within an hour of waking to really set yourself up for success. But every once in a while, we really need to be able to see what's going on under the hood.
Yeah, yeah. The one more thing I want to touch on before we close up here is cycle syncing, because you did mention it to me off air. And for those who are not familiar, it might be helpful in certain situations. So can you go over that really quick?
Sure. So cycle syncing is the practice of aligning different areas of your life to where you're at in your cycle. So for example, eating certain foods at during different stages of your cycle will really influence the way that your body and your hormones are manifesting. And so, for example, if someone has painful periods, really being intentional about only eating warm and hot foods during your luteal phase and during your menstrual phase can really reduce pain and cramping. Right. Also, eating more fermented foods can really benefit that estrobolome, right? So help you manage your estrogen better. And then you might have less estrogen dominant symptoms, less PMS, things like that. But this also can relate to everything from like how we eat to how we socialize or how we are intimate with our partners and like what's going on in terms of our sex drive. And so there's a lot of different layers to it. I would say for someone who's dealing with PCOS, if you're not having regular cycles, it can be kind of a cool way to tap into like what it's so quote unquote supposed to feel like, to really just be like, okay, I'm going to start with the new moon and I'm going to, do 1 week for each phase of my cycle if I'm not actually cycling, and kind of like see how this is supposed to feel and get into that like rhythm of what a cyclical being is like. And it can really inspire you to want to do more in terms of like getting your cycle back on track. And with people with endometriosis, it could really help with pain management.
Awesome, awesome. And there are a lot of resources out there on cycle syncing. I mean, you can look more into it, friends, if you're really interested. And I'm sure Stephanie has information on it as well. But I thought I've never really, I should say, I've never really gotten into it. I mean, I knew what it was, I know what it is, but I've never really adhered to it. But I've always been really fascinated by it. And maybe I should, just for fun, right? Because I'm not necessarily over here having like, super, I don't have a lot of intense symptoms in this arena. I'm not somebody who's deeply suffering, but I have in the past, depending on life and things, different seasons present different symptoms. And so it's something that I've always been sort of fascinated by, because I think it's so interesting. Like you said, we get into this rhythm and we don't even really understand how connected everything is to everything, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think even if like cycle singing is truly, truly such a gift and it gets you so in touch with your divine feminine. I 100 like very much lived my life on a cycle syncing rhythm for many years before getting pregnant. I now haven't had a period in like almost 2.5 years because I ecologically breastfeed my son. And so it's like common for women to not get their periods back for 2 years with that. And so it's been a long time for me. And I miss that like rhythm and the way that I was living my life, because it really does give so much more meaning to like every decision. And you just feel like how I imagine women felt like when they were like, witchy and dancing under the moon. Like it really is so amazing. So if you were up for it, Vanessa, I would totally encourage you to just like try it out for a few months, because I think you might never go back.
I'm sure, you know what? It's something that I feel called to look more into. And I think that's honestly, I think it's why I asked you, because, we could have tied up the show 5 or 6
Yeah.
minutes ago, but I really, really wanted to hear what you had to say about it, which tells me it's something that I need to sort of bookmark. So I will get back to you on that for sure.
Totally. If you haven't had an episode on cycle syncing, we should totally do like a part two, because it is like in itself like a total hour and a half and so amazing. I have a chart that I can send you to get started that you can just put on your fridge to kind of be like, okay, well, where am I supposed to go? What am I supposed to do?
Oh my gosh.
Um, it's a lot of fun.
Yeah, no, I would love for you to send it to me, and I would love to have you back to do that. I think it would be an awesome, awesome episode. I think a lot of people would be interested in it. So yes, I'm going to hold you to it. So speaking of, where can people find you if they want to learn more about you, if they would like to maybe look into working with you? Also, you have a podcast, so I want to make sure and mention that. So where can people learn more about you?
Yeah. So Instagram is my primary social media. Come say hi on there. I love connecting with other people. So just send me a DM, like let's voice note. I love it. It's just such a fun way to grow community. And I find I have so many people around the world that I feel so connected to because of it. So I love that. Feel free to just come say hi and let me know what you liked about the show. If you want to work with me, I also can give you information about that on social media. I have links in my bio, also my website, stefanieadler.com. Stephanie's with an F. And is just a really great way to learn more about the work that I do with women. I have offers for just hair mineral analysis if you want to dip your toes, or we can go all in and do, you know, deep one-on-one work. And I also have a group program. And then I also have a podcast called Wisdom of the Womb, where we go into topics like this in depth in a really relatable way. The podcast is so much fun. Come say hi. And that's pretty much how to get in touch with me, unless you want to come say what's up in Colorado.
I love that. My friends, I will definitely list all of these resources for you. So if you want to get in touch with Stefanie, which I highly encourage you to do so, at least go follow her on Instagram. It really is such a great thing for practitioners and for all of us to really connect with you guys. It really, it just bridges a gap, you know? So I encourage you to do that. But all of this will be in the show notes. This has been so great. I have thoroughly enjoyed this conversation. I've learned several things to be really during this chat. I really have. I mean, and I say this a lot, but I feel like the more that I learn, the more I realize that I don't know. And I'm always learning from you guys. I really am. And I love it. And you know, you too. I mean, you sit in the podcast host seat. I'm sure you're learning from people often as well when you interview. And so it's really been a delight. And I'm sure that our listeners have gained a lot of food for thought in terms of, you know, endometriosis and PCOS and fertility and gut health and so forth. But you've given us a lot to chew on. So I appreciate you for taking the time to come on. Thank you for having this conversation with me. It's really been a pleasure.
Thank you so much, Vanessa. I'm really happy to be here.
You're more than welcome. All right, you guys, I hope you have a blessed day, and I will see you on the next episode.